Thanks for joining. As Johanna mentioned, my name is Ariana, and I sit on UNICEF Innovation's blockchain team, actually currently in New York right now, and joined by my colleague Christina, who leads our blockchain team, who's also currently in New York. And we're super excited to chat about the work that we have been working with Johanna and others on in terms of building up the blockchain group and ecosystem within UNIN and across the UN. So to get briefly started, I wanted to help us map out what the UNIN blockchain toolkit and ecosystem is at the moment. And it's very new, as Johanna mentioned. So last week is actually when the UNIN blockchain website went live, where the survey to join the group was published. And so it's exciting to hear. I haven't heard numbers yet, so to hear that there's over 100 people interested is super great and awesome for us blockchain nerds to see that others are excited as well. So really, the way that we have been thinking about the blockchain group and the practical guide and the Atrium, which we'll get to, is that the group is really the foundational piece where everyone can get together and have dialogue, share ideas, share any questions, and really activate the 100+ people that are interested, and then hopefully expand to the 2,000+ that are part of UNIN. And then the two tools right now that exist are the practical guide to blockchain, which UNIN published last week as well, which if you haven't seen it is live. And most of this presentation will be spent discussing the practical guide, how it came about, what the contents are, how you can use it, etc. But really the practical guide is an information and resource tool for anyone to use. It's open actually to the public. But this is really where if you're just getting started in your blockchain journey, or if you're trying to evaluate whether or not blockchain is right for you, the team that worked on it wanted to create a very practical, sturdy guide for you to have. And then a new tool that we're introducing that actually goes live tomorrow, which is super exciting, is the Atrium. And so this is an online tool that the team has been working on that I'll speak more about towards the end of the presentation. And actually next week, there will be an entire webinar devoted just to the Atrium. So if your palate is wet and your appetite is wet enough and you want to learn more about it, you can join us next week. And again, it goes live tomorrow. But this will be a place where the group can actually engage online together and can see what else is cooking in the UN around blockchain. So from here, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Christina, to talk about the practical guide, which she helps spearhead.
Thank you, Ariana. And so great to see so many colleagues on this call who are either new to blockchain or interested in learning more, because that's exactly what this practical guide was developed for. So I'm going to quickly just run you through an overview of what's included in this practical guide, how it came about, and then I'm going to give you an example of how you can actually use the tool yourself. So starting with a bit of background of how this came to be, last fall, the UN Innovation Network was asked to present to the Secretary General and the heads of agencies on what is blockchain and cryptocurrency. And that conversation really concluded with remarks around the table being interested in what is blockchain, what are the use cases around the UN, and how can we use blockchain more systematically between agencies, with a request to come up with a paper around exactly those topics. And so we're really happy to be able to share this publicly now with our fellow colleagues, to be able to use this as a tool to work together and to collaborate. And so this practical guide that we've written is really just a starting point. And so we want you to use this as a paper to understand the fundamentals of what blockchain is. It doesn't get very, very technical. We've kept some of the more technical elements in the appendix. If you're interested, you of course can go and learn. But at a high level, we've included some definitions. We've included some key considerations and some questions you should ask yourself when you're looking at whether blockchain might be the right solution for what you're exploring, and some tools such as decision trees or diagrams that you can reference as you go through this paper. One example would be just fundamentally, how does blockchain work? That's always a very complex question that we're always trying to answer. Even having been in blockchain for several years now for myself, knowledge is always changing. And so it's good to have a foundational document to go back to understand some of these basics. So moving on from this, the guide also includes the high level use cases of where you can use blockchain. So it's great if you understand the fundamentals of what it is, but then you need to apply it to your work and understand how could this technology apply. So we've bucketed this really into 3 high level use cases. One's around data, the next is value exchange, and the next is efficiency. And we've included generic examples of how you could use blockchain, for example, for public records or for supply chain tracking, digital financing, cryptocurrency, smart contracts, or incentivization. And some of those might seem like scary words in and of themselves. And that's why we've included these examples and definitions throughout to actually walk you through how that would work. One of the things that we're often faced with is whether we should use blockchain as a tool. This is the big question. Is it the right solution? Are we just using blockchain for the sake of using blockchain? And so we've created a 2-step process in the guide to help you walk through some of these questions. The first is a set, you can see the set of questions that are very basic questions asking you, for example, would you traditionally require a database to store this type of information? Or do you have multiple people who need access to the information? When you answer that first list of questions, that should give you an inkling of whether it's more likely or less likely that you require a blockchain. Of course, none of these are definitive tools, so we always encourage you to consult with your colleagues who are familiar with either blockchain or IT solutions more generally to give you some directions. And of course, the UN community is also here to assist you in this. But if you do, on the off chance, end up in a position where it seems like it's more likely a blockchain might be the right fit, what we have included is a decision tree to actually walk you through the next level of questions that you need to consider. And not only that you need to consider, but what type of blockchain you might need to use, because there are different types of blockchains. So I want to walk you through a really quick example how something like this would work. And so I'm going to assume that we finished those first 10 questions around whether blockchain would be the right fit, and it gave me a more likely score. So now I'm moving on to my decision tree. In this case, I'm going to use the example of creating a comprehensive view of learning credentials for young people. So you can imagine if I'm thinking of Aksa, who's a young girl who lives in the Middle East, and she has attended several schools over her educational career. What you really want to have is a wholesome view of all of the schools and the certificates that she's received, so that no matter where she is in the world, she has one view of all of her education. So using the blockchain tree, what I can do is I'm going to obviously start at the start bubble. And first question might seem a little bit obvious, but can you articulate the problem you're trying to solve? In this case, I think we can articulate it because I just defined it to you. So that would take us down to the yes. Then from there, are you trying to store structured information? And in this case, yes, we are. So Ariana, can you flip to the next slide on this one? There we go. So in this case, we know that it's structured information because some of the information we're storing, for example, is name, grade, year, location. That's fairly structured. And so in this case, that means that we're continuing down the yes pattern. So then there's a whole series of other questions. I'm not going to walk through all of these because you can go and run this through with your own example. But you'll see that I've continued the exercise here. It takes us down the flow chart, and I have another series of questions that I need to ask. And finally, what I'm going to end up with is that I might need a permissioned blockchain. So again, we don't want to use any decision tree or flow charts as absolutely prescriptive. We always suggest that you consult with someone who's very familiar with blockchain, but this should give you an inkling of which way you should go. Now, you might be panicking. Oh goodness, I don't know what a permission blockchain is. Let me tell you, we've included some tools to help you with that. So you'll notice that here there's actually a diagram that explains the difference between a database, a permission blockchain, and a public blockchain. Typically, what you will have read about and heard about often in the news, that is typically a public blockchain. Those have different features than a permission blockchain, which is typically what you'll see an enterprise, a government, or even the UN use as blockchain technology. So You'll need to be able to understand the difference between those two types of blockchains, and we've included lots of material to explain the difference between those two. And what we've also done, as I mentioned before, is these run-throughs of what is a general use case in the area, for example, of public records. I was just talking about educational certificates, but could I walk through a generic example of public records? And so we've included some of those in the guide as well. So in this case, it talks about business licenses. I do want to highlight that there are currently 8 UN projects that are featured inside the guide. Now, this is an ever-evolving guide, so if your project is not currently included in the guide, we would love it for you to reach out to us and to provide us the details, and we will update the guide. It's a living document, so nothing is set in stone. But to give you an example of a couple of the projects that are highlighted, and there are others from UN Women, from UN OICT, UN Habitat that are also included. But to give one example for each of the categories, for data, for example, in the food supply chain, you have WFP who talks about their transparent supply chain in Africa and how they're actually able to reduce the amount of paperwork and increase the efficiency from many, many weeks down to a few days, which is a great example of using blockchain to actually share one source of information across multiple parties. Then from value exchange, cryptocurrency, there's examples of how UNICEF is using cryptocurrencies to make investments into early stage startups and what that looks like, how the crypto fund itself works. And lastly, around efficiency and digital engagement, UNDP and UNICEF are working on a project in South Africa, which actually digitizes both educational and work records so that you have a digital CV, essentially. So very similar to the example that I mentioned before, that's already happening in South Africa. And so you can read more about that in the practical guide as well. So I quickly want to just run you through what the guide would look like. And I know that Johanna has shared the link in the chat of where you can actually go and you'll be able to visit the guide yourself. It is public. So the link is there. We'll share it again afterwards as well. But the guide, you might notice, has a very different look and feel than some other guides you may have seen. If you're curious about why there's fungi and trees, you'll have to read this little blurb on page 3 about why we did that, but it was intentional in why we did that. So the paper starts off with a background on what is blockchain and how it works, and then goes on to what are the main functions. Following that, you'll see the key features of blockchain. So there's a few to walk through there, and then how blockchain can help. So there's 3 high-level buckets: immutable record keeping, transfer of value, and automated rules such as smart contracts. You'll also find throughout the guide that there's these little bumblebees who will alert you to a little learning moment. So sometimes it will talk about people using blockchain and Bitcoin interchangeably, which is a common error, or it will refer you to the appendix for some additional information about whatever you're reading about. Section 2 is really where we start to get into these tools that I talked about. So the road to blockchain and determining whether it's the right fit. You'll see that there's the list of questions that I mentioned before, talking about the difference between a public and permission blockchain and that diagram, and then getting into some key questions to consider just beyond the decision tree as well. So you have this decision tree here, obviously, that I've shown you already, but there's some key questions like, what is the problem you're trying to solve look like, and what does the ecosystem around it look like as well? We can't forget some of the core IT questions and principles that we would typically ask ourselves just because we're using blockchain. So starting from that point of understanding the problem and your users is very important. And then from there, you ask yourself some questions around who needs access to the data. Is there an element of mistrust? And mistrust, use a very wide definition of that when you're going through this. What type of data are you storing? And it walks you through all of that. Some of you may be curious about cryptocurrency, which is one of the applications of blockchain technology. And so there is a section on cryptocurrency there as well. And then we get into uses by UN entities. And so there's a high-level diagram that kind of categorizes them. We give some generic examples that I've walked you through already, and then mechanisms for systematic use. And so this is really how we can come together as the UN, as one, to work together on initiatives. And so you'll see some that Ariana has already mentioned to you at the forefront. So for example, the Atrium, which is this UN-wide tool open to all of you to actually learn more. So if this guide is just the starting point and you're really interested, the Atrium will be the next step to find more learning resources and other things that Ariana will share with you. So I don't want to jump too far into that. There's the blockchain group that Johanna mentioned at the beginning. There are other working groups on specific topics. And then these different modalities of actually investing in different elements of not just blockchain, but also digital public goods. So I'm going to end there. There are also a lot of goodies in the appendix, especially the UN use cases. Quickly jump to those, which is the section here. And so you can actually go in and see all of the different use cases that we've highlighted from the different agencies. And if you would like to have your project added, please do reach out to us. We would love to extend that list of projects that are included. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ariana.
Great, thanks, Christina. Let me get this set back up. So following the guide, as I mentioned, the second tool that we have developed with UNIN is something called the Atrium. And so if you have been following UNIN, you may actually have heard of the Atrium as it started at the UNIN Accelerator held at the World Food Program Accelerator last year as part of the Interagency Boot Camp. So the team has been working on this for a year. It is co-created with UNDP, WFP, and UNICEF under the UNIN umbrella. And really it was designed in the impetus for the idea came from the notion that, you know, each of our agencies were working on blockchain projects. We heard about other blockchain projects happening within the UN. And up until really this point, so much of the conversation relied on informal relationships of learning what other people were doing. The information and knowledge sharing wasn't seamless. However, I know a lot of our teams like to focus on open source technology and knowledge sharing as really catalysts for innovation. And so, you know, we thought, what if there was a tool that allowed people to learn about blockchain and to actually share what they're working on. And then ultimately the end goal would be that people would begin to innovate and collaborate on these blockchain projects together. And so this will officially launch tomorrow. So after a year, I think almost maybe a year to the day of working on it, it goes live tomorrow, which we're very excited about. And it includes, as I mentioned, resources to start exploring, project details about different UN blockchain projects, so some of the ones that Christina mentioned in the guide. And actually, so the whole website, which I'll get to the screens, is voluntary, and the information is voluntary. So if you have a project you'd like to share, you can go ahead and upload it to the Atrium. And then community forums. So again, how can we create different opportunities for people within the blockchain ecosystem within the UN to share their ideas and information? So we created a forums page. So these are 3 of the screens that represent each of the 3 sections. So you'll see the projects page, which people can go in and add projects, project details, project owners. Our blockchain team, specifically at UNICEF, create open source blockchain projects. So you'll see for some of our projects that we have actually included the source code. So for those that are more technical and want to get into the nitty gritty, you can get in and see that. We also have the community forum where you can go in and ask questions, all the questions that you may have. If you're not super familiar with blockchain, you can ask there, or if you have an idea for a project that you can, you know, say that you want to collaborate on something and you don't know where to start, you can post in the forum and people can engage that way. And then we also have a plethora of learning resources that we have curated from all the different areas and online resources that we've gone through, whether it be an online course or an article or a video series, so that you can have a bit of like a succinct way to learn about blockchain. So as I mentioned, it goes live tomorrow, and I'm not going too much in detail because we have the full webinar next week, so hopefully we'll see some of you there. And then there will be an email coming out from UNIN tomorrow with all the details, as well as social media tweets, etc. It's a super simple process. Signing up takes less than 10 minutes. So we hope to see you in the Atrium. And I will now shift it over to Johanna to facilitate some Q&A.